About a week ago, Andrew Whitaker, our planning director, who's well known to pretty much everybody, sat down with Michael Bingham, who's the acting chief planner at DCLG at the moment. This conversation took place just before Boris Johnson's announcement on planning reform, so we'll come back on that at the end. But here's the conversation, fascinating as it is, I think, between Andrew and Michael. Andrew.
It's lovely speaking to you this morning. I'm Michael Bingham, I'm Interim Chief Planner at MHCRG. I thought I'd just kick off by giving a brief overview of some of the work that's currently underway to support the planning system, and there is a huge amount going on. There are three themes I will highlight. The first one is what I've called flexibility and delivery. Now, a lot of this is about keeping the existing planning system moving during and as we emerge from the pandemic. So we've used primary powers through two emergency bills. We have the Coronavirus Act back in March that allowed virtual planning committees to take place. On the 25th of June, we published the Business and Planning Bill, and that brings in a number of things that the sector have been looking for: an automatic extension to planning permissions, the ability for PINs to use a variety of methods when they're holding planning inquiries simultaneously, and the ability for developers to request variations to conditions that limit site operating hours. There's also been secondary legislation, so we've introduced time-limited permitted development rights for cafes and restaurants to work as takeaways, for emergency facilities to assist with the pandemic. And we've also given a commitment that we're going to bring forward further secondary legislation. So that's partly in relation to the ability to use virtual inspections of local plan documents rather than physical copies. And also in terms of allowing deferment of SIL payments for smaller builders. So there's more secondary legislation to come. We've also published written ministerial statements. I think there's been at least 3 of those now. The most recent one, again on the 25th of June, was there to support the Business and Planning Bill, but also particularly in terms of how the electronic inspection of documents can be relied upon in certain situations other than plan making, as I mentioned just now. We've also published a number of changes to guidance where that can also help to keep things moving during the current situation. So, for example, in relation to local plans and neighbourhood plans. So there's a lot of work we've been doing to try and keep things moving, but also we need to keep looking to the future in terms of how we keep delivery going. So there are a number of things that we've put into the public domain as things that we are working on. So the First Home Scheme and a review of how we assess local housing needs are 2 particular priorities that we are progressing at the moment. And also permitted development rights is something that we've been continuing to work on. So we've introduced regulations to enable building upwards in certain circumstances. And also we're continuing to work on a permitted development right that would in certain circumstances allow the demolition and rebuilding of certain buildings. So that's the first important theme, about keeping things going, about having a flexible planning system, and about supporting delivery, particularly of homes. A second theme, though, and perhaps just as important, is improving the environmental dimensions of development and also the design quality of development, which is very much a government priority. So 2 things that we're seeking to progress fairly quickly now are the response to the work of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which was issued at the turn of the year. And also, and it's allied to that, we are working on a national model design code, which will provide a template for local areas to work from in developing their own codes. And on the environment side, there's a lot of work going on to meet the manifesto commitments that wherever possible, new streets should be tree lined. So how can we get those in place as much as possible? The Environment Bill hopefully will be reintroduced to Parliament very shortly, which brings forward a raft of measures, some of which directly affect the planning system, not least mandatory biodiversity net gain measures. And we're also working on a review of flood risk policy to see whether there are any changes that are merited, or indeed any changes that are merited to the procedures for assessing flood risk, so that we can try and mitigate the sort of risks that we saw earlier this year with some serious flooding events, particularly in parts of the north of England. And then the final theme is wider reform, and there's been a lot of discussion generally about where this might be going. We are still intending to bring out a white paper later this year. I can't say exactly what the scope of that will be, but we have signalled that we particularly want to look at how the system is resourced, whether there are further changes to procedure that may be merited, and also, and very importantly, how we can go further in digitising the planning system, building upon the rapid changes that we've seen just recently. We know as well that we will need to have a further look at the National Planning Policy Framework. Some of that flows from the things I've already highlighted, like the work of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and possibly the work on flood risk, depending on where that ends up. But there may be wider things as well that we need to address through those updates to the NPPF. Local plans as well may be something that we need to look at potentially through the white paper. There are procedures there that might potentially be improved. There are issues with the timeliness of plan making and the degree to which plans are up to date that we and others are well aware of. So that's something that we're thinking about as well. So there's quite a big bundle of things there for the longer term that we are working on at the moment. And obviously all of these things are being progressed simultaneously. So there's plenty on at the moment. And that's all I wanted to say by way of introducing the work that's going on currently.
Well, there's definitely a lot going on, Michael, isn't there? And thanks very much for that roundup. I'm sure there are many, many more slides that you could have put up for us to look at. The first question I've got really is how well do you think the planning system was able to cope with a global pandemic? Were you surprised at the amount of work that you had to do to allow the planning system to continue?
I think in general terms, the planning system has responded pretty well. Like almost every aspect of public administration and the economy, things had to move pretty quickly. And it's reassuring in a way just how many processes adapted quite easily to working digitally, whether that's the submission of planning applications by applicants, work by consultants, or work by local planning authorities. We did see quite a rapid move towards virtual working, and it demonstrated the art of the possible, I think. Obviously, it's been a bit patchy. We know that some authorities inevitably were geared up more than others to working remotely at short notice. And we've certainly tried to work very quickly to bring in supporting changes that enable digital things to happen where that wasn't previously the case. So that's particularly why we prioritised virtual planning committee meetings as an important step. And I think it's gratifying that most councils have been using virtual meeting arrangements to continue looking at planning applications. So I think by and large, there's been quite a rapid response.
And while some of these measures are quite clearly only temporary measures, do you think that there will be some of them that are carried forward, and which ones are you most setting store by to bring planning into a digital age, for example?
You're right that most measures at the moment are time limited, but we do want to learn from this, and this is going to be one of the big themes for the white paper, I think. We've almost pressed the fast forward button on digitising the planning system, so lots of things that were starting to happen anyway have really been accelerated. Obviously, there are other things that can happen potentially in relation to digital planning, like the virtual presentation of development plans and things like that. But in terms of the administration of the system, a lot has happened very quickly in terms of moving online. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from this potentially. So PAS, for example, is doing some very good work on best practice. And we want to glean what we can from that in terms of whether there are longer term changes that we should seek to embed in the way that the planning system works.
You touched on design, of course, as a very important part of the government agenda going forward, and we all read the report of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. and I assume that you're going to try and implement as many of those recommendations in that report as you can. So how much of a balance do you see the design agenda as being diktat from central government through the National Design Guide, the National Design Code that you mentioned, and local authorities having to produce their own local design agenda?
You're right that it's a top priority for government, and I think the Secretary of State's already said that he intends to respond to the Building Better report as positively as possible and to take forward as much of the gist of that report as possible. There is a balance in terms of the direction that comes from central government and what local government does. So we are seeking to take a lead by publishing the National Design Guide that's already out there and the National Model Design Code that's being worked on at present. But the idea is that they are templates, if you like, to be applied at the local level by local planning authorities and by applicants in terms of how they incorporate good design into their schemes.
Some might say that the increase in permitted development rights is anathema to good design, and that allowing more permitted development rights means that you'll struggle to increase design quality. How do you answer those people?
I think there are two answers to that. One is that there is obviously a balance between flexibility and prescriptiveness in the system, and where permitted development rights are going are situations where the government feels that the principle of development is something that it's okay to establish upfront at a national scale, given the impacts. But there are important safeguards in certain circumstances. So earlier on, I mentioned the latest building up permitted development right, for example. That includes certain prior approvals. One of those relates to appearance. So there will be safeguards that government seeks to include where it thinks it's appropriate.
Moving on to local plans and local plans around the country, I've been at HBF a long time, and it seems that every year the government gives us a new deadline by which time we're going to have full coverage of local plans. And every year the government threatens to take action against local authorities who haven't got a local plan in place. The minister's just given us another deadline or target date of 2023 for full coverage. And it seems to me that some authorities have taken this as an excuse to take a deep breath and say, let's put off preparing our local plan until 2023. What would you say to those local authorities?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that where we've previously highlighted authorities that really needed to make more progress, we have seen action. I think of the 15 that we highlighted previously, 13 have now submitted plans. So by working with authorities and trying to get them over the line or to make progress, we are seeing results. You're right that plan making remains slower than we would like. There are issues there that we need to think about. But where there are some of the oldest plans in the system, we are seeing some real progress being made now.
Do you not think that some authorities don't actually want a plan in place? You know, I could mention people like St Albans, York, who are preparing plans that we feel they know full well are going to be thrown out at an early stage. And they can point to this and say, oh, it wasn't our fault that our plan was thrown out. It was unsound. It was the inspector's fault. And they're putting the blame back on you.
I think most authorities in our experience do want to get a plan in place. Clearly, the consequences of not putting a plan in place are different for different locations, where you've got Greenbelt, for example, unallocated land that's in the Greenbelt obviously has a high degree of protection in terms of national policy. And again, there's a bit of a balance here for government, because there are certain things where we say nationally there are important protections like the Greenbelt, but equally we do need to see progress with plan making. I don't think many authorities actually don't want to put a plan in place. And I think from the feedback we get, they tend to get quite frustrated where there are hurdles along the path, if you like.
Are you concerned about the people who've been trying and striving to get joint planning work done, like Greater Manchester, like South West, North Essex, Oxfordshire, for example, who signed up to a growth deal and now seem to have kicked the can down the road? Are you worried that the duty to cooperate and strategic planning doesn't seem to be able to continue in the current planning climate?
It's certainly a concern that a number of strategic plans have not made the progress that was hoped for. We're very much in favour of joint planning and strategic planning, for example, for metropolitan areas. It is a good way of trying to resolve strategic issues. I think it's important that we all learn from the recent experience in a number of locations as to what the hurdles have been for getting those in place. And that's certainly something we want to reflect on.
So moving on to the future, Michael, do you think that we're facing a planning revolution, or are we going to see evolution of the planning system?
I think it's genuinely hard to tell at the moment. The government is certainly thinking about the longer term future of the planning system. We're at this fairly unique time where we've got a combination of economic challenges, continuing social challenges, not least in terms of people having a home of their own, and of course big environmental challenges. So what we need to think about is whether the planning system is fit for those different purposes, and in particular whether it offers enough certainty in certain respects, but in other respects whether there's enough flexibility. So for example, where land might need to change use quite rapidly because of the very rapid changes in economic circumstances that we're seeing, does the planning system facilitate those changes quickly enough? Those are sort of big questions that we need to be thinking about.
So do you think now is the right time to introduce major change to the planning processes that we all know and love? Would it not be better to let everyone take a deep breath, get back to work and implement what they know?
There's perhaps never a good time for planning reform. People will always argue that things should just carry on as they are. But equally, we do need to think about the circumstances we're in and whether there are sensible things that we could do with the planning system that would make it operate more effectively for all of its different users, whether that's applicants, the local community, local authorities. So, we think that there are some important questions that we ought to be considering, but in terms of where that will end up, I can't say just yet.
We're going to enter a question and answer session with the audience, but I know two questions that they are going to ask. The first is, are we going to see a review of Greenbelt policy and Greenbelt boundaries around the country? And the second is, when is this all going to happen, Michael? When are we going to see the planning white paper? When are we going to see these changes take place?
Yeah, there is always intense interest in the Greenbelt, and clearly the government has said that it remains committed to preserving the Greenbelt. I can't say whether there will be any further changes to Greenbelt policy around the margins or any wider changes. At the moment, that's not what we're thinking about in terms of where the NPPF is. Certainly, there's very clear policy on the Greenbelt. In terms of your wider question about when things will happen, we are still working on the white paper, as I said. Timetables that we envisaged back in March inevitably have been affected by the pandemic, so which has pushed things sideways. I'm hoping that there might be some announcements before summer recess, but inevitably some things are probably going to be later this year at the earliest. So we'll just need to see how things pan out. We are trying to progress these things as quickly as possible, but inevitably our working ability has been affected both by all of the emergency response work we've been doing and by the redeployment of planning staff onto other emergency work within the department.
So thank you very much, Andrew Whitaker, Michael Bingham. Fantastic insight there. And also, we've been running a poll whilst we were listening to your interview, and you may see that the results, which were that about level pegging here, about 1/3 of our delegates responding thought that there should be a fundamental review of the local, a fundamental review of the planning system from first principles. And another third thought that there should be increased resources for local planning authorities. So in terms of the fundamental review of the planning system from first principles, an interesting answer in reflecting on the Prime Minister's announcement speech last week, when he talked about a reform of the planning system, unlike anything we've seen since the Second World War. So I'm delighted that Andrew and Michael are both here live to take questions and to have a conversation. So maybe we could go there, Andrew. First of all, in terms of the reform of the planning system and also the resources that are required to process planning applications.
I think fundamental review is always a problem because people don't know what to do. You know, is it as I said in the session with Michael, is it better for people to pause and carry on doing what they know how to do? With regard to resources, it's always keen for people to put that onto planning application fees. But actually, I think local authorities need to invest more in their planning departments. If it's an important function for them, they ought to be prepared to invest the society's money from council tax into their planning service.
Thanks, Andrew. And Michael, so just in thinking about the Prime Minister's speech and the announcements that have been made with regards to that fundamental review and the timelines for that in terms of the white paper, when do we expect to see these things happening?
Well, Neil, the Chancellor confirmed yesterday what the Prime Minister said last week, which is that we intend to put a paper out very soon now, before the summer, looking broadly at the future of the planning system. Although, as I said previously in the presentation, we are working on a number of shorter term measures as well. So you can expect a number of announcements. And to pick up on what Andrew and others have said, we are very conscious that in bringing forward any proposals for reform, we need to be really clear about what those are and how that might affect things that are in the system, because the last thing we want to do is cause undue disruption to the market, delay housing or other schemes that are in the system. So that's one of our key considerations. And we are looking very broadly at a number of things that have been raised today and in the questions on the chat. So certainly things like resourcing of local planning authorities, how we bring sufficient confidence and flexibility to investment in the high streets, all sorts of issues like that are things that are in the mix.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for those that have submitted questions today. I'm sorry that we haven't got time, unfortunately, to go through the questions that have all been raised, but there are things regarding Section 106 and SIL, and Michael touched on in his response there in terms of the considerations for government at the moment. So, as I say, in the interest of time, we've got about 15 minutes to go of today's session. So I would just like to say a very big thank you to Michael Bingham for preparing his presentation, being interviewed by Andrew, and joining us live here today. So thank you very much, Michael.